Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde. We are going to go ahead and get started for our next session. Our discussant is Hui Albuquerque. Our presenters include Mushira Al Jazeera, Beetham Singh, and Carol Kampiki. So we are just going to move straight into the presentations and the discussion. This particular session will run from 2:30 to 4 o'clock.
Boa tarde a todos. Estamos aqui começando uma sessão sobre the future of funding for higher education, com uma mesa seleta. E eu vou pedir, I will ask you, please talk slowly, because we have the help of translators that know the subject but are not professionals on translation. So, if you could please talk slowly, in a slow way, why? Bom, eu mesmo sou Hui Albuquerque, só ampliando um pouco a apresentação. Eu sou professor da Universidade Estadual de Campinas, do Departamento de Política Científica, em tempo parcial, e também hoje assessorando o reitor do ITA, do Instituto Tecnológico de Aeronáutica, que é um professor do Unicamp, Carlos Pacheco, e também trabalhando no Centro Nacional de Pesquisa em Energia e Materiais, que é um centro próximo ao Unicamp, que congrega 4 grandes laboratórios em biotecnologia, etanol, nanotecnologia e estrutura de materiais, que é o síncroton. Enfim, aqui eu estou com o meu chapéu de professor da Unicamp e com muito prazer recebo esses nossos colegas. À minha direita está a professora Mushira, que é da Fundação Ford do Egito, PhD em Estudos de Desenvolvimento, feito nos Netherlands. Professor Beetham Singh, que é da Comissão de Planejamento do Ministério de Planejamento da Índia, especialista em educação, com PhD em Ciências Sociais. À minha esquerda, Carol, que é diretora do Programa de Estudos Urbanos da Universidade de Washington, é isso? Foi fundadora, founder do Programa de Urban Studies de Washington University, né? E trabalha com muitos trabalhos em educação e fez seu PhD na Universidade de Northwestern. Então, nesta nossa sessão de trabalho, we are giving 20 minutes for each one of the speakers, 20 minutos para cada um dos expositores. E eu começaria com a professora Mushira, falando sobre o caso do Egito em financiamento de higher education. Por favor, professora Mushira.
Thank you. As I started to think about addressing the issue of financing higher education, it really occurred to me that Egypt is not a unique country in any way in sort of grappling with the issues of financing, because in the last decade or so, all universities around the world in advanced and developing countries have been addressing the issue of financing. So the diminishing revenues of the universities, the increasing enrollments, all kinds of tensions have risen that made it imperative for most countries of the world to question the financing of higher education. But what I thought was important for me to do was to not show the uniqueness of Egypt, as I said, but just to show why the question of financing and reform of higher education is very important in the discussions nowadays back home. And it is a very politicized context. It's a very difficult kind of conversation that a lot of people do not feel they are ready to make. And this is why I think it's important to talk about it. And that explains why I have that title, whether the government is asking the right questions, whether it is ready to do what it takes to promote a dialogue around higher education and its financing, and try to get over the difficulty of this discussion. Just wanted to take a minute to tell you about why Ford Foundation is invited to this meeting. I work with the program, and I've been working with them for 10 months, so less than a year. And it started 5 or 6 years ago to be a program on higher education equity in access and success in higher education. So the main concern was equity, and there was a reason for that. The reason being that in the last few decades, with the increasing privatization of higher education in Egypt, which I will speak about in a minute, Ford Foundation felt a need to redress some of the inequalities that resulted from that privatization and hit, most importantly, those who study in public universities in Arabic and in social science departments. So this is really the group of students that we were most concerned with in the higher education program. After the Egyptian uprisings of 2011 until this point in time, we started also to give some attention to civic engagement on the part of the students and the university. So a broader role for the universities in public life. This is how we define civic engagement. Now, I will not try to repeat anything that Ray said, but I will try to, if I have to repeat it, just to show that there is an important message that I want to say, which is a bit different from what he said. And I want to refer here to the main development in the higher education scene and landscape, which is that it became a public service, free of charge after the 1952 revolution. And that was also associated with the very big scheme of public employment, so every graduate of universities, so everybody was entitled to a job in the public sector. Well, this is a very important development because it has really marked and framed all the discourse and the discussion around higher education, which I feel has been very difficult to shake. I mean, people have been feeling that this is an entitlement. Higher education, as education as a right to health and to housing, are entitlements that cannot be taken away from them, which made the discussion and the societal debate very difficult. And that's a very important development. Now, since that was okay, I mean, to allow higher education to be free and to give a job to everybody was fine until the 80s, when it became very clear that the socialist legacy of Gamal Abdel Nasser was crumbling, and it was impossible to provide that kind of work, of opportunities to everybody. So this is when the government started to give up its commitment to public services, including education and employment. Of course, the result of this massification of higher education has been mainly a very poor quality of education, very large enrollments. Right now in Egypt, we have around 2 million students in public universities. In one university, only Cairo University, we have 350,000 students. So the numbers are just really huge. There were also other strains in terms of infrastructure, in terms of course, the financial resources and the staff. The share of public expenditure on higher education is just about 1% of the GDP. This is not a bad figure, and it's comparable to other OECD countries and countries of the lower middle income level, like Egypt. But the expenditure per student across countries with similar per capita income shows that Egypt is doing quite poorly on spending on the students. And in the last few years, public expenditure on higher education has also been declining relative to the total public expenditure on education and relative to total public expenditure. Because the government has decided to pay attention and to give sort of a priority to the privatization of higher education. So less money for public education because private education is now available. As expected, this attempt to meet the high demand on higher education without sufficient matching resources has been, as I said, at the expense of the quality. The Egyptian universities do not appear on any kind of ranking, of higher education institutions. very poor on the competitiveness, a report on the quality of higher education, very down the list. Very poor on the degree to which higher education satisfies the labor market. So there's really, really very serious questions about the quality of education, including, by the way, quality in the private universities, which remain to a large extent a black box. We assume that when people pay money, they get better quality education. We have a lot of question marks about this, and we're really exploring that statement. Now, what has happened in the 1990s is that the government made a noticeable shift towards the privatization of higher education, and a number of private universities rose. And as of today, there are around 28 private universities, which is equal in number to the public universities, although the number of students in private universities is only 5%. So public universities are still the preferred destination of most of most students, secondary school students. Now there are lots of internal and external challenges in terms of the efficiency of higher education. 78% of the budget goes to current expenditures as opposed to capital expenditures. So this goes mostly to salaries and to the admin staff salaries, not even to the teaching staff. There is very little private return of higher education. It's very low. It's higher for the employees with secondary school students, but lower than those who can only read and write. Unemployment is also very high among university students and secondary school students, and very low among people who do not have any education. Now, higher education is also biased against the poor because most of the public spending goes to the rich income quintiles, and students rarely come from the lowest income quintiles. I'm still talking about public education here. And the poor have very little access to higher education because, as we all know, the rich families can afford better quality secondary education, which they give, which is reflected in the grades in the high school system. Now, I would like to say something about the recent events, the Egyptian uprisings of 2011 and the most recent events. In 2011, in January, people took to the streets and started to voice demands for social justice and lots of cries for jobs, for dignity, for bread. And there have been lots of expectations from the successive governments, and public impatience was growing because nothing was being delivered. Now, the economic situation in Egypt is quite scary, and there are no resources to do anything really major or significant. But really, the issue is also about the political stability, which is needed to pursue any meaningful reform. This has been completely absent. In the last 3 years, we had 6 cabinet reshuffles. And in the 3 years and the 6 reshuffles, all ministers of higher education had changed. So there was really no opportunity and no space for anyone to think in a major or a constructive or long-term way about the reform of higher education. But now this is my sort of clincher, the point that I really want to make. More importantly, about the instability, we were always left with the impression that those ministers are not very concerned with the questions of social justice that people went out, to the streets to ask for. And their performance showed us that they are not ready to initiate any societal discussion of some of these very politically and socially sensitive and charged files, which is education included in them. And really, there was a lost opportunity because a few months ago, we had a large-scale discussion around the Constitution, and we had the opportunity to include a stipulation there that higher education is not going to be free. That was an opportunity that no one sort of thought to do or dared to do. It was going to be a really massive discussion before anybody would agree to do it. But it was a lost opportunity. And I think it was important to do it simply because de facto people know that higher education is not free of charge. Public education is every day students and their families incur expenses from their pockets on textbooks written by their professors, which is a major industry and profit-making enterprise in Egyptian universities. They spent money on photocopying. There's a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. And now lots of studies are taking place. Not lots, but we're encouraging studies to take place on how much is it really that people spend out of their pockets on higher education. Because de facto, it is not free of charge. Now, I have two main things that I want to speak about. The one, which I'll briefly say a few words about, which are the unexplored options for financing higher education. So organizations like the Ford Foundation, even though we know and we realize that no one just now is listening to us and the ministers are not there, they're thinking about how to secure positions and how to stay in the cabinet and so on. But we have been investing in a lot of research around options for financing higher education. And these are not things that we invented. I mean, other countries have gone through them, and there's been a lot of literature around that. First one is to consider raising the tuition fees across the board. So public universities would have tuition fees. But in that case, we would have to make sure that the quality of education is then not compromised, because for the time being, what we have in the public universities are special programs. They invented special programs that teach in English and in French as opposed to Arabic, and they are supposed to have and to offer higher quality education. So should we decide to introduce cost sharing in a serious manner, we would have to pay special attention to these groups that have, so far been excluded from the alleged high quality education that we are talking about. Those who study in Arabic and those who study in social science departments. So raising tuition fees is one possibility. It would require also that we consider different fees for different families in different income groups, and that would be a challenge in the Egyptian context, because it would require that the government is able to accurately identify the financial means of different families, which is not easy under the circumstances. The second intervention, which is possible, is again something on which there's a lot of literature, is the introduction of loans, student loans. And this is again a case in which hypothetically, tuition fees would be introduced in public institutions, because otherwise there's no need for that. There are no fees, so to speak, in public institutions now. But if we were to introduce the fees, you would come up with some scheme for loans. Again, this is not going to be very easy, because people, both students and banks, are very concerned about the high rate of unemployment among university students and whether they would indeed be able to find a job after graduation and be able to repay the loans. How it looks now is that the banks are not really interested in the students themselves or in education as a cause, but in their parents, in the wealthy parents whom they plan to take on as customers and as clients. So the education idea is really not part of the way they've been thinking. The government has not shown any readiness to play the role of collateral, so it makes everybody very nervous again about the loans. The fear is that the loans would reproduce the cycle of disadvantage, in that the banks would still go to the upper income families and the well-off, so because they're sure that they would pay them back. They will not go to the students in the first year because they're afraid of dropouts, and they will not go to the students, and this is very important, who do not have a good opportunity in the labor market, and namely these are the social science department graduates. This is really a major issue if in a country like Egypt, where the graduates are 60% and sometimes 70% from social sciences. The government has a big decision to make here. I mean, everything is really very interrelated. Loans are related to quality, are related to social sciences versus hard sciences. So lots of questions that the government needs to be thinking about before it decides to begin one project versus the other. And speaking of social sciences, again, private businessmen, have been financing scholarships in areas that are useful to them, like all the globalized specializations of finance, marketing, computer sciences, and business administrations. Very little attention, again, to social science departments. And these are, of course, the specializations that are gaining currency among businessmen, but also among the students and the families themselves. So, again, social science departments are going to be a problem should the government decide to take this very seriously. And it would put a lot of pressure, as I said, on the government to deliver on quality of higher education. Now, I want to make a final intervention about the role of private foundations, and I think this may be my sort of contribution to this meeting. I work in one of them. Ford Foundation is a private institution, and I want to make some comments in bullet forms. The first one is that there is a visible lack of understanding about the role of private philanthropy in general, but in education in particular. And just now in Egypt, some academic institutions have taken the responsibility of making it more popular in the society, talking about private philanthropy, and trying to link it to the traditions, to the old traditions in Islamic history, to say that endowments for public good, private endowments for public good and public service has happened before in the past, and it's part of our heritage. So people are working on this. My second point, the money that private philanthropy can offer is really, in the wider scope and picture of things, very little. We do not have a lot of money to contribute. But what really matters as far as private philanthropy is concerned is the niches they create, the small little areas in which they focus, and the approaches they devise that can present models for reform. So we don't contribute big money, but we contribute ideas and models for reform. So unlike the World Bank and other big financial institutions that put a lot of money in big projects with the government, foreign donors tend to work on small scale, on the level of faculties, on the level of departments, and we intervene to produce good practices and research evidence and try to produce figures and statistics and so on, and also give visibility to the area of higher education, the problems of higher education. Now, the third point is that in the last few years, since the Arab uprisings, there's been a growing interest among donors and international organizations in universities and in young people in general, but also in universities. And I think what happened after a few months after the uprisings in Egypt gave people maybe a false hope that things were changing for the better, that the institutions were becoming more democratic in terms of governance and so on. So a lot of donors have shown interest in working in the area of higher education, and are ready to finance, particularly, as I notice now, the area of civic engagement. So there is more on, how to make students more intrinsic, actors and significant actors on campus, and how to make the universities reach out to the communities and so on. So there's more interest on civic engagement. But there's also been a tension because under this very politicized situation in Egypt, very volatile, these organizations have to make sure that their understanding and definition of civic engagement is also what how the government defines civic engagement. You really don't want to have any more confrontations around, foreign intervention in university affairs and so on. Okay, my before last point is that organizations like the Ford Foundations have been in Egypt for a very long time, since 1952, and so it has nurtured a lot of close relationships with the academic community and with scholars and so on. So there's no problem with Ford Foundation as such, but we have to admit that there's been and there's a continuous attack on civil society in Egypt, both local and international, and it makes any work in whatever the government decides is a sensitive area, it becomes very, very problematic. It raises question marks about foreign intervention in security and national security affairs and so on, lots of red line topics. So the biggest challenge for private organizations who are interested in financing higher education is to, for example, in the case of Ford Foundation, make sure it is clearly separated from the position of the American administration. Make sure to emphasize the private philanthropic role of Ford Foundation as opposed to the American official position. So this is all. I just want to sum up by saying that, again, the title of my presentation, Are We Asking the Right Questions? I want to say that in the absence of a strong presence of the state and a clear vision on how the state wants to finance higher education reform, this road is not likely to really lead anywhere. We need to be very clear about the sense of direction, where university presidents would like to see their universities going, especially when it comes to questions of equity and social justice. And I repeat that though funding is a critical issue, but more important really is the compass and the sense of direction in this particular area. For example, I personally see two directions in reforming higher education when it comes to access and equity. One of them was raised by Ray in the morning, and this is really where the radical transformative change can take place around access, which is the end of the prep stage where people are excluded and those who go to the universities are really the rich and so on. This is, I think, a major and a very significant area of intervention should the government decide to take a transformative stance towards the reform of higher education. Otherwise, there's always the very safe road that we are taking just now, which is rather cosmetic, rather not serious, trying to address all the problems that are, resulted from privatization and so on. It's important to do that, but these are not the main equity issues around higher education in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you. You've accomplished your 20 minutes quite right. Is it slow enough for the translator? Tá bom? Please. Professor Pitansin, please. We'd like to.
Yeah. Very good afternoon. Actually, in India, it is midnight, 12 o'clock. So had I not been there, my body clock is really feeling very bad. But anyway, before I start my presentation, this is the title you can see, this expansion, equity, and excellence. These three cannot be discussed in isolation. They are totally interdependent. But before I go to my presentation, I'll take 2 minutes before telling about the Indian higher education system. Let me put it straight away. First of all, I really very thankful to University of Campinas and University of California, Los Angeles. So they invited me and provided this opportunity to interact with such august gathering from all over the world. Especially when I got that invitation, I was told in advance that I will have 10 to 15 minutes for the presentation. And really traveling 25 hours in a plane, speaking for 15 minutes looks were not justified. But because the theme of the conference was so exciting and more relevant to Indian context, so I took all the pain, travel all along and learned more from you people than rather telling about the Indian system. So this is before I go for the presentation, I'll tell that India is a huge country of 1.2 billion people. It has huge diversity in terms of pure geographical location, in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of food, in terms of clothing. You name any culture, any disparity, any that exists in India. So in my presentation, I'll keep talking about the various social groups, how they are excluded and what is their share of participation in higher education. Before I just start presentation, I'll tell that India has a very rigid caste-based, occupational-based society where your hierarchy is determined by the kind of occupation you are involved in. Some people who are involved working in low polluting work, it's like a sweeping, cobbler, squining, they are considered to be low. Not only low, but earlier they were untouchable. And actually, it was 1931 when first census was done, and some of caste engaged in the lower job, this miniature job, were identified and put a list that is called scheduled list. And that is, the caste comes under that is called scheduled caste. Then other category which I will keep referring about the scheduled tribes. These are the peoples who live in isolated area, primitive, have distinct culture, shyness, not interacting with the people, and quite backward. So other category will be that scheduled tribe we keep referring to. That third is other backward classes. That is based on their economic criteria. Some castes were identified and they were put on the beneficiaries list. So that will be keep referring about the other backward caste. Then a minority, of course, the Muslims, non-Muslim, you can understand very well. Some minority community like Sikh, Parsi, Jain, these are the minority community which I'll keep referring. Now we have a challenge, but biggest challenge here at the TRUI has given me how many minutes? 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And my problem is that I speak very fast. And if I speak fast, then I can meet the deadline of 20 minutes to meet. But if I speak fast, then the translator will be in a problem. So there is a conflict. So we have to strike the same as we have a conflict here in our, if suppose I go for expansion, there is always expansion is needed to increase accessibility. That will give more equity, but there is always fear of dilution of the quality. And suppose you expand without quality maintenance or without assuring quality, that may be counterproductive, which is not good for the future. So my presentation will be in the 3 parts. First, of course, I already told this all interrelated, but since it is divided in 3 parts, first I will talk about the expansion. Before this, in that Indian education system, because I will be concentrating only on higher education sector, but here this education as a whole, we have a very huge number of elementary and secondary education system. Our system is 16 to 14 is called elementary. Elementary means it's primary and upper primary. The age is 16 to 14. Class 1st to 5th is called lower primary. Then 5th or 6th onwards, 6 to 8 is called upper primary. Then if you enter to the high school and then senior secondary school. Then after senior secondary you enter to the higher education. We have 140 million enrollment in elementary education. Is the speed okay. So we had about 60 million in secondary. And if combined together, this is more than the population we have here in Brazil. The number of the students really is a huge system. So we have big system, huge system, that huge challenges also. So as a historically, India has a very rich and glorious tradition in the higher education. 2000 years ago, there were 4 universities. One is the University of Nalanda, University of Taxila, University of Vikramsala, then University of Vallabhi. These 4 universities used to attract students from all over the world, particularly in South Asian countries, and especially from China and Japan. But that is history. India was at the time of British colony in 1857, the 3 universities were set up. That was University of Calcutta, University of Madras, and University of Mumbai. After 1857, it took 30 years to set up another university, University of Allahabad. That is 1888. So, but the education system was not for the interest of the common man. It was the elite class. And British system, they wanted to teach only the things which can be benefit to their colonial capacity. So the system of education was not concentrated mainly on arts graduates only. No science or technology took place. When we got independent in 1947, India has nothing substantial in terms of infrastructure, institutions, or very few universities, about 20 universities and about 600, about 600 universities at the time. So it was the first, because India have a planning process. We plan for 5 years, and in each plan, the thrust and priority area is identified by the politician, because it's a federal structure. The politicians come with their manifesto, they give some promises. According to their promise, that promises has to be converted into the action and program and policies. So in the first plan, that is 1951 to 56, there was nothing about the higher education. Only some emphasis was given to the elementary and to some extent the secondary education. Actually, it was the second plan from 56 to 61 when the university education system expanded, and specialized institutions like Institution of Technology, Institution of Management, they were set up, and there was a tangible shift from agriculture sector to the industry sector. So there was a demand for this higher education. During third plan, that is, it started from 66 to 71. There was huge expansion of the infrastructures, that is preparation of the science teachers, building the laboratory, equipment, other related. Fourth plan, that is 71 to 75, nothing was done in higher education, but emphasis was on elementary education, and that is too in the area of backward areas, and that too especially focus was given to the girls' education. So next plan, it was infrastructure development, then it was consolidation, till 11th plan, that is from 2007 to 2012. There was a major shift in this. Actually, it was the base of the 21st century education. There was huge investment made. Yes, the major expansion took place in the last 2 decades, that is 2007. And the plan outlay, but the total size of the outlay in 10th plan, that is 2002 to 2007, it was 6.7% only to the education share. But in the 11th plan, from this 2007 to 12, that was the share of education went up by 19.4%, from 6 to 19.4% of the total outlay. And out of this, 30% was earmarked for higher education. So in terms of, it was 9 times higher than the 10th plan outlay in the 11th plan. So that means there was huge shift change in investment during the period of 2007 to 2010. Then in absolute term, it was 95,000 million rupees, went to 850,000 million rupees in absolute term. Next slide, please. See that expansion. At the time of when we got independence in 1950-51, there were very few, 26 universities, 695 colleges, which went up to, see, in 2012, now more than 35,000 colleges. So during this period alone, last 2 decades, there was huge jump in the number of colleges. Similar is the universities, it went from 256, 574, and now we have got 700 universities. The India in a higher education in terms of the institution is very complex. Complex in the sense we have central universities, yes, means the university funded purely by federal government. We have state universities which is funded by the state government. We have deemed universities which is partly funded by the state government, partly funded by the central government. We have the institution of national importance and research. We have the minority institutions like Muslim Aligarh Muslim University, Jamia Millia University. We have institutions of specifically target for the social group. We have one special university in the alone subject was the University of Study of Disabilities. So it's a huge complex higher education system. So next, if you see the number of institutions that went up from 11 to 2007 to 2012, there is a huge increase in number, 65 alone. Now we have got 152 institutions again. And these are our central institutions, which is purely funded by the federal government. In terms of enrollment also went from 13.8 million to 21.7 million. But more importantly, if you look at, there was a huge increase in the private enrollment in the private institutions, the private colleges and private universities. It went up to, the rate was up to 58% over the period of from 10 to 11 5 plan. So this is actually an indication that there was huge investment made by the private investment has come in a big way to increase that enrollment. Next, please. Now, if we see the stream-wise enrollment during the two periods, 2006 and 7, you will see that enrollment in the arts and other stream has drastically come down. Almost in every stream, the enrollment has come down, but the engineering went from 13% to 25%. Here is actually problem, because during this period, the engineering institution was set up by the private entrepreneurs, and that is causing problem for India because there is a quality issue in that. Most importantly, as a constitution, India education is not for profit. If any income or any profit comes from educational activity, it has to be reinvested to expand the facilities in higher education itself. But it is in the constitution. They are the institutions, those who are purely for profit making and like that. Next, please. The GR, the gross enrollment ratio, that is normally it is measured that absolute enrollment divided by the eligible population of higher education, that is 18 to 23 age cohort. So this went up, now we have got 20.4% of GR in higher education. Look, this is the investment during the last decade, from 2001 to 2012. The most important tracking is to see from 2006-7 in 2013-14, it went up, who jumped. So despite of all this expansion, the huge investment, where do we stand in the international comparison? Just see in terms of GR. We are among us lowest, even our BRIC countries. Brazil has got, I think, 26% GR now. Somebody correct me if there is some, but it's 26%. The source of data is given, of course, if that may be updated. But despite of serious effort, still we have a very low GR, 20%. Now, okay, just a few. Now, because I'll give, out of these 10 minutes, I'm going to spend more than an equity, because this is the theme of the quality issue. I'll click through, it's no problem. You just give me the warning before 2 minutes, so there will absolutely no problem. Equity, see, India expanding very fast in higher education. We have seen unprecedented growth. But there is a serious challenge of equity. Equity in terms of both regional, there is a regional disparity, there are interstate disparity, there are gender disparity, there is socio-economic, rural, urban, there is huge disparity among. We have at this 28 plus 6, 34 states where I have enlisted graph. Next one, please. See, in terms of the gross enrollment rates, there is a 53% in Chandigarh, one UT, that the highest one. Then we have got 33 and 34, and as lowest as 2.4% in the Mandiu. So, see, this kind of a disparity is very difficult to address, and the government is really struggling hard to do that. Next. You see the gender disparity, it's very clear way speaking. There is a rural male, female. The male has 13%, rural female is 8.3% only. Then we have got urban 29.6 male, female is 13.7. SC male, female, there is a disparity. Then total, there is a disparity. So, if we look about the disparity of women in general enrollment and higher education participation, it seems that they have been narrowing down the gap. But the quality of institution they have been studying, this is another area which we have to find out. Which stream they have been studying, that is the another area. But mostly the engineering and medical colleges, we will find very few. This is actually the comparison between two period time, the 2006 and 2009, how we have improved upon this disparity among GR. See, there has been increase SCs, it's from in 6 year 8.7 to 11.5. ST, this one, and this is all clear. So this is clearly visible. Next, please. Now, I will focus more on the government initiative to address this disparities among various social group as well as the regional. For regional disparity, we identified 374 districts which had very low GER. 374 districts where has been planned to set up one degree college, one model degree college in each educationally backward districts, EBDs. And the state also being given incentives if they set up institutions, universities, colleges or engineering colleges, the half of the financial support is given by the center. Conditionally, if the state provide land free of cost and they are ready to bear their recurring expenditure. So, these are the schemes actually, two major schemes. One, to incentivize the states for building the institutions. Other, providing full amount from the center for making colleges specific for women. If it is for set up, the state want to set up colleges or university for women, money is given from the center. So this is trying to address this one. That we have the four major ministries who are implementing various welfare schemes for the different social group. The Ministry of Human Resources and Development, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, the Ministry of Minority Affairs. Next, please. These are the, already I have spoken, these are the measures we have took for this regional disparity. The next, please. Next. Next slide, please. So, the most important, what you call the affirmative action, the India has, they providing the reservation to all these social group proportional to their population. Scheduled caste, their population about 18.6%. They have a reservation in admission, 17% seat reserved for scheduled caste, 7% for scheduled tribe, then 3% for person disabilities, and 27% for other backward classes. This is the one most important action where the participation of this social backward group has really paid some dividend in terms of their presence in the higher education system. But the problem is, in some of the group, the reserved seat goes vacant because no suitable students is available. Reason behind it because the secondary there are huge dropout among ST students at the senior secondary level. 70% from 1 to 10th, if you enter first standard, by the time it reaches 10th standard, 70% the students they drop out. So once they drop out, automatically the opportunity to participate in higher education is stripped off. So this is a major concern, so we are addressing that issue too. There are our financial, we have a pre-matric, post-matric scholarship, then we have the scheme for girls hostels, we have a scheme for free coaching for SC/ST to participate in the national national entry test, in entering for the services of UPSC, Short Service Commission, Railway, anywhere, so these are coaching. Then these are the scheme for backwards. All three ministries more or less implementing the same, except little variation in the eligibility criteria. But minority of tribal affairs, Ministry of Minority, they are implementing scheme for minority, Ministry of Tribal Affairs for the tribal, and Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment for scheduled caste and other backward classes. Excellence. So this is various scheme program which government really implementing, and huge investment in terms of that's already gone anyway. Now, despite of that, quality we have gained on the expansion, but quality has suffered. As per the Times Higher Education Survey, no university or no institution figure among top 200. IIT Mumbai, IIT Kharagpur, they are 237, 230, 268 position. But among top 100 is none of the university or the institutions. So, but we are not concerned about it in the sense because the ranking of international standard is, you look at the criteria, is very different what we in India has in the education system. First, they look at that if you are the single discipline university, you are excluded from that survey because you have only very narrow strength. Their most important factor they go by the teaching environment, which is particularly teacher and student ratio, the quality of curriculum, then the research funding and the research volume, the income from the research, the international outlook. All these criteria in India has a very weak in that we acknowledge it everywhere in the document. So other measure of concern in quality is low employability. One survey done, they say only 10 to 15% graduates are employable. 25 to 30% engineering graduates, the survey says that they are employable. So there is a serious issue of the increasing unemployment among the graduates. This is a serious concern and one of the top agenda for the policymakers to correct this. Then the problem is here that due to the fast expansion, there is acute shortage of the faculty. In this central institutions, on an average, the 40% post of the faculty are lying vacant. Still lying vacant today itself, despite of the best effort. Then student and teacher ratio is much more than any international standard. Yes, next one, please. This is one of the criteria for investment in R&D. R&D, we have only 0.8% of GDP investment, whereas other country, you see the as high as 3.4 and 4.8% in case of Israel. The United States 2.8. Then India is the lowest, 0.8% of total GDP investment. So we are investing very low comparative to other countries. Next, please. the number of PhD. Other criteria, they say the output, the research output, the PhD manufacturing. I was reading an article, the manufacturing of the PhD. So out of the PhD, we have, see at 2002, we were more or less same as China was. We were 12,000, they were 15,000. By the end of 4 or 5 years, China went up to 36, we are 19. Now we are 20, China 41. And by the latest figure of 2011, China has targeted 125,000 PhDs, where our total enrollment in PhD in 2011 is only 77,000. So we are also lagging behind in the PhD, the people getting the PhD and doctorate degree. Next, please. Then there is enormous growth in faculty and teaching staff, but it's not keeping pace with the number of enrollment we are increasing. Next, please. They already spoken that the institution-wise they have given the list of the faculties and the percentage, the post lying vacant. Next, please. Now, there is an international assessment is very important for maintaining quality in higher education. So we have a National Assessment and Accreditation Council which assess the quality, but it is not mandatory. It is volunteer. None of the private universities or colleges is ready to come under this NAC. So if you see the total, hardly 14-15% colleges are accredited, and in case universities only 31%. So one of the ways is to make that accreditation mandatory, and this is we are thinking to bring a law or act. It's already lying in the parliament. Next, please. Some of the key issues to address this faculty, particularly infrastructure gaps, the 12th plan initiative, the major initiative is the National Higher Education Mission. Actually, the most of this enrollment in the states. I would say the more than 90% enrollment in the state, and the state education in terms of infrastructure is very in shabby conditions. So there is a scheme where the central will fund some of the infrastructural gap conditionally that the state are ready to reform their educational reform, and that they are ready to take education reform, both governance and academic. Okay, thanks for hearing.
Okay, thank you for coming, and thank you, Walter and colleagues, for the wonderful invitation. I'd also like to thank my two co-presenters who took far more than their 15 minutes. Okay, the title of this presentation is Corporate Philanthropy and American Higher Education, Cui Bono. The two quotes on the following page capture the title and the content of this presentation. The major focus is to examine the growth of private corporate influence in higher education, irrespective as to whether those post-secondary institutions are public or private. The key question is corporate philanthropy at what cost? The terms often used in these discussions are commodification of the academy, privatization of a public good, or the increasing corporatization of higher education. A long tradition extolled by Thomas Jefferson, John Dewey, Richard Hofstadter, W.E.B. Du Bois, and C. Wright Mills extols the importance of free education as essential for a just and democratic society. Today, however, American universities are responding to the demands of the marketplace as knowledge is being used as a form of venture capital, and where professors have become academic entrepreneurs and students have become consumers. This presentation looks at the social, political, and economic dilemmas surrounding the increasing corporatization throughout American higher education. It concludes by examining some of the social costs of our corporate culture and what portends for the future in American higher education. With respect to theoretical considerations, Some perceive that the growing corporate influence in higher education is due to a loss in state funding. However, such a statement ignores the fact that in the last quarter of the 19th century, universities in America integrated well with the industrial economy, shifting from a focus on theology, moral philosophy, and the education of gentlemen, overseen by clergy, to science-based disciplines ranging from chemistry and engineering to the social sciences and the humanities. Land-grant institutions established by the Morrill Acts of the 1800s played an important role by contributing to the industrialization of agriculture. At the turn of the 20th century, in an information age society, knowledge and forms of new knowledge are inseparable from the new global economy. Because American universities are seen as a major source of knowledge production and utilization, the linkage with the global economy is immediate. Researchers posit a theory of academic capitalism which focuses on networks, new circuits of knowledge, networks that mediate between public and private sectors, extended managerial capacities that link institutions as well as faculty, administrators, the government, think tanks, and students to the new economy. New investment, marketing, and consumptive behaviors on the part of members of the university community also link them to the new economy. It is these mechanisms and behaviors which constitute the academic capitalist knowledge learning regime. Whether one agrees with all of the aspects of the theory, it is illustrative for our purposes. Figure 1 looks at the academic public knowledge regime, and they differentiate it by utilizing the Mertonian strand, borrowing from the work of R.K. Merton and his normative structure of science. Here, communal means non-commercial, and universal refers to the idea of no national caste to science with a free flow of knowledge. Now, challenging the public good model, figure 2, is the academic capitalism research regime model, which is characterized by the development of new networks of actors who develop organizations that span and blur the boundaries between public spheres and private interests. Key to understanding this model is the knowledge that colleges and universities and all academic professionals within them are actors initiating academic capitalism, not just as players being corporatized. This model seeks to explain the processes by which universities integrate with the new global economy. While the industrial economy focuses on mass production, the new economy heavily utilizes computerized techniques requiring smaller numbers of educated workers and larger numbers of part-time or contingent workers. Two major caveats are important here. First, the theory of academic capitalism does not specifically state its borrowings from the larger body of theoretical literature on political economy and the role schools play in the political economy of the society. As a result, the work of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mills, Karl Marx, and even latter-day social reproductionists are not reflected in the theoretical underpinnings of academic capitalism. And for this paper, political economy is defined as the study of how economic laws benefit or harm material wealth and social development. It is also defined as the nature of wealth and the mechanisms by which it can be accumulated. Included as well are the social, political, and economic consequences of economic development, whether they be intended or unintended. Second, this paper does not focus on corporate colleges, defined as institutions offering post-secondary degrees, which were initially established by an entity, profit or nonprofit, whose primary mission is something other than granting college degrees. This includes business, capital, service, and manufacturing corporations, as well as professional associations and clubs formed to provide educational support for members of particular professions. For example, General Motors Institute, McDonald's Management Institute, famously called Hamburger University, the Northrop University, a division of Northrop Aeronautical Corporation, or the Wang Institute of Graduate Studies in Software Engineering. Now, one lens by which to examine the depth of university corporate intersects and interrelationships is to examine university endowments. These endowments represent voluntary support from alumni and non-alumni, from foundations and corporate giving, including endowment income. Our next graphic, the Endowment Table 1, examines the most recent data on the largest endowments in U.S. universities. Now, while the full report is approximately 50 pages, I just want you to note the following in Table 1. We now have in the U.S. more than 80 colleges and universities with endowments of $1 billion or more. Harvard alone has $32 billion, nearly $12 billion more than number 2, Yale University. Savvy fundraising, shrewd investing, and general tax laws make all this possible. Now outside the U.S., only England's Oxford University and Cambridge University are in the same financial class. Such wealth allows institutions to take other sources of support, student revenues or state financial support, and use them as a base. Intuition at the average billionaire private college starts at about $30,000. At public institutions in the same group, tuitions start at approximately $10,000. Now the top 20 institutions are quite dissimilar. Each of the 8 Ivy League schools is of billionaire status, as well as other private elite moneyed schools, including Stanford University, Duke University, Northwestern, University of Chicago, Washington University, etc. Also included are small private liberal arts colleges, number 36, Williams College, number 39, Amherst College. Other factors. In the top 20, some schools are very small. Stanford University's total enrollment is 15,000 students, professional and undergraduate. Washington University in St. Louis, the total enrollment is 14,000. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology's total enrollment, graduate and undergraduate, is 11,000. The University of Chicago's total enrollment is 15,000 as students, as compared to major public university systems who are more than triple the size of these private elite schools. The University of Michigan, number 8, has approximately 44,000 students. The University of Texas system has approximately 53,000 students. That's number 3. Texas A&M University system has over 140,000 students. They're number 7. The University of California, separate and distinct from the California state system and the California community college system, numbers approximately 240,000 students of both graduate and undergraduate levels. Now, what all the schools have in common is that by American standards, they're old. The average age is 170 years, ranging from 102-year-old Rice University, number 20, to 378-year-old Harvard University, number 1. As such, these colleges have had centuries to build a reputation, reap the rewards of compounding investment returns, and produce generations of alumni who can be tapped for donations. Our next table, Table 2, further examines the corporate and private university intersects or overlaps. An overlap is defined by instances in which a trustee, regent from one or more universities, serves as a director on the same corporate board. Table 2. The full paper includes an analysis of about 100 institutions, so that's understandable. Table 2 looks at corporate and private university intersects. Now, this table examines the top 10 private and public research universities as defined by annual research and development funding, who had as trustees 100 people who sat on the top 30 capitalized corporations in the U.S. or on the boards of the National Science Foundation's top 500 research-performing corporations, representing a total of approximately 61 firms. Table 3 shows the dominant corporate sector representation by private universities and public research universities. Table 4 shows the summary of corporate board interlocks. You want to pull that table up a bit. Pull it up a bit. There we go, all the way, all the way. So we see public and private. Okay. Table 4 shows a summary of corporate board interlocks shared by universities at private universities, shared by universities at private universities and at public universities. Note that the frequency of overlap among board members from private universities is significantly greater than that observed among public university board members. This can be seen most dramatically in the numbers reported in the bottom panel of Table 4. Only 3 of 10 public universities exhibit an overlap. Pennsylvania State University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the University of Pittsburgh. Considering the degree to which advantages are accrued through board overlaps that provide opportunities for trustees and the schools they represent to come in contact one another, most public universities, even though they are research universities, are at a decided disadvantage. 7 public universities in the sample are completely disconnected through this network of the most elite universities and corporate board memberships. That is, there is no path that exists through the overall network that would link these institutions to other elite institutions and corporate boards in the sample. Figure 5 illustrates this point well. In contrast to the disconnected nature of public universities, all private universities in our sample have at least 2 connections to other private institutions in the sample. You want to go to figure 6 now. And you see the intersect and the overlap in terms of the private research universities, the corporate board sponsorships, and the like. So in figure 6, we summarize the overlapping board memberships among private institutions in our sample. And all these institutions have at least 2 overlaps. 6 private institutions have trustees that serve on at least 5 corporate boards on which trustees from competing universities also serve. Now, all of the previous graphics that I've shown you were based on 2010 data. Let's look at some research from 2013 data to see how little has changed. Can you find table 6 for me? On the basis of this 2013 data, it shows the 10 most connected universities and their interlocks with corporations, with think tanks, and business policy discussion groups from this 2013 database. And finally, figure 7 unarguably captures the most visibly connected university in America, and that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So let's just leave it there for a moment. So complete is the corporate influence that corporate language is filtered in the language of higher education until we've become quite used to it. Witness a few: HTML, strategic planning, benchmarking, best practice, re-engineering, synergy, logistics, new economy, big data, among others. So what portends for the future in terms of these interlocking agreements and overlaps with corporations and think tanks and higher education? As American higher education has moved from its traditional base of simply educating the elite, they have become a normal part of the educational experience of larger and more diverse student populations. This evolution from elite to mass accessibility has resulted in higher education more closely resembling a public utility than an experience reserved for privileged elites. The shift to higher education as a public service has resulted in state legislators treating the academy like any other public utility. They demand the most effective service at the most affordable price. The language used to define effective and affordable derives from a business model for generating value, where value is linked to short-term monetary gain. This, for Americans, redefines the traditional understanding of higher education's value, where value is linked directly to the long-term welfare of communities made up of informed citizens actively participating in the democratic process. Privatization, or the growing corporatization impact in American higher education, is such that it increases the pressure on traditional public higher education institutions to operate more efficiently, to pursue goals set by outside interests and to market more aggressively. Practices such as contracting out services and restructuring the workforce represent market-driven attempts to control payroll, to diversify and stabilize revenue and shift costs to consumers. Now, with respect to contracting out services, how does this play out in terms of American higher education? Colleges and universities now use outside vendors to provide a range of services, from food services, laundry services, bookstores, concessions, travel, printing, entertainment, daycare, health services, safety and security, post office mail services, and the like. With respect to restructuring the workforce, thank you. With respect to restructuring the workforce, most new full-time faculty positions in American higher education are not tenure eligible. According to a recent study, only about 1/4 of our new hires receive appointment to full-time tenure-track positions. 1/2 of the new hires are part-time, and the remaining quarter start in non-tenure track. College teaching is now running the risk in America of becoming a contingent workforce. As an indicator of the expanding contingency workforce in higher education and the increasing use of part-time faculty, over 40% of higher education faculty in the U.S. now work part-time. With respect to diversifying revenue streams, with the maturation of computer technology and the internet, education in America is no longer place-bound. New portable colleges offer college programs through massive open online courses with huge enrollments, targeting students who might not otherwise attend colleges. Such colleges, I might add, are operated as for-profit enterprises. As noted earlier, part of the business lexicon transported to higher education is accountability, as some state legislatures have begun tying public funding directly to an institution's performance in measuring up to prescribed goals. The definition of accountability changes the locus of decision-making from internal to external groups. The proprietary sector group, the corporate colleges, are the purest expression of privatization. Now, what are some of the social costs of growing corporate philanthropy, the growing privatization in higher education? Richard Hofstadter, the noted American historian, observed the peril that corporate values pose to education and stated that the best rationale for supporting higher education lies not in the services they perform, but in the values they represent. For Hofstadter and others, it was the values of justice, freedom, equality, and the rights of citizens as equal and free human beings that really should be at the heart of what higher education means in order to fulfill its role in educating students for the demands of leadership, social citizenship, and democratic public life. According to some social critics, the growing influence of corporate philanthropy on university life in the U.S. has served to largely undermine the distinction between higher education and business that educators such as Hofstadter and others wanted to preserve. So how is corporate culture manifested in the life of the academy, and at what social costs? For the sake of time, I will skip several pages and move to how corporate funding flow to the universities and how those areas of study that do not translate into substantial profits either get marginalized, underfunded, or eliminated. What is occurring is both the downsizing of the humanities and social sciences and the increasing refusal on the part of universities to fund research sufficiently in services such as public health and other social welfare areas that are largely utilized by people who cannot pay for such services. Similarly, programs that focus on areas such as critical theory, literature, feminism, cultural studies, ethics, or concern with social issues could either be eliminated or technicized because their role in the market will be judged as simply ornamental. The new corporate university values of profit, control, and efficiency outweigh considerations about pedagogy or the role of the university in the preservation and enhancement of social responsibility. We see the wide-scale naming of universities, which is also evident in the number of endowed chairs funded by major corporations and rich corporate donors. In some situations, the funding of endowed chairs often give universities and businesses an opportunity to play a significant role in not only selecting the appropriate faculty member, but also in selecting the appropriate courses of study to be taught. In this way, corporations influence what kind of research actually takes place on university campuses. Probably the consequences of transforming research into a commercially driven enterprise can be seen most clearly in the profitable bioscience and pharmaceutical industries. The overwhelming majority of research investment in the pharmaceutical industry has not gone to saving the lives of millions of people in the developing world, but to what has been called lifestyle drugs that treat such maladies as impotence, obesity, baldness, and wrinkles, even though malaria, polio, tuberculosis, and respiratory infections killed over 10 million people last year. While pharmaceutical companies have spent more than $24 billion in research working with universities to develop high-profit drugs such as Viagra, only $2 billion will be spent on drugs used to combat deadly diseases, even though diseases such as malaria are expected to kill more than 40 million Africans alone in the next 20 years. We also see the perilous effects of the complex connections between universities and corporations concerning intellectual property rights, licensing income, and patenting agreements. Other critics suggest that these management models, these corporate models of decision-making, are replacing faculty governance. The language of educational reform has become divorced from broader considerations of social responsibility. In the administrative sphere, management has become a substitute for leadership, as university presidents have become CEOs. Today's college presidents are known less for their intellectual leadership than for their role as fundraisers and ribbon cutters, filling a slot rather than changing the world. These comments harken back to the days when university presidents in the U.S. were national luminaries, influencing social equality in intellectual and political life. Such former college presidents as Benjamin Mays, Mordecai Johnson, Charles Eliot, Mary McLeod Bethune, James Conant, Robert Maynard Hutchins, Father Theodore Hesburgh, Clark Kerr, Kingman Brewsters, and others played both intellectual and social roles in transforming not only their universities, but the social relations and social democracy of the larger society. Some critics suggest that it was the aftermath of the U.S. recession and the terrorist attack of 9/11 when many colleges and universities experienced financial hard terms. But a downturn in economic conditions and dwindling government finance projects coupled with a sharp reduction of state aid to higher education really only added to the issue. The larger point is that higher education in America should serve a more noble calling, a more noble purpose, that it should be safeguarded as a public good to be held by all of society's citizenry. Situated within the broader context of issues concerned with ethics, with social justice, higher education is now being challenged to offer both its students and its faculty the opportunity to involve themselves in the deepest problems of society, to acquire knowledge, skills, and vocabulary necessary for critical dialogue. The key is to affirm scholarship born of social commitment for the public good, for the good of the larger society. Higher education we should now call upon to represent the conscience of the society. As researchers remind us, programs in many universities that offer remedial courses, affirmative action, and other crucial pedagogical resources are under massive assault by conservatives who want to eliminate them from the university and in any attempt to address the inequalities in the society. A recent student-driven Occupy movement with the slogan, "We are the 99 percenters," has been mobilized against corporate influence in the university and across the globe. Social critics are calling upon faculty to finally learn the lessons from our students, so how we can learn how to mediate the tensions between the public values of higher education and the commercial values of our corporate culture. So how much influence will major donors have over university affairs in the forthcoming years, the forthcoming decades, as we attempt to educate students not solely for the extrinsic value of schooling, not solely for the extrinsic value of schooling, but for the intrinsic values of social responsibility and critical citizenship in a democratic society? Going back to our data on corporate university interlocks and linkages, as MIT so vividly shows us, we need to carefully examine what flows across those corporate linkages, who decides those flows in the light of what interests, and what collective or corporate action flows from the organization of linkages. At the heart of it all is the meaning of higher education in America and what purposes it will serve and for whose interests. Thank you.
Para nos dar mais 20 minutos de debate, pode ser? Fazer o café às 4h30. Ok? São 4h10 agora. Nesta mesa, ela nos apresentou posições extremamente interessantes. A professora Mochira nos falou do Egito, e num país onde uma crise política muito claramente estabelecida, aliada a uma crise econômica que leva a uma crise fiscal, coloca em xeque a capacidade do Estado financiar o ensino superior como ele vinha sendo feito antes. E colocou também as dificuldades de usar mecanismos convencionais, como, por exemplo, o nosso programa de financiamento pela Caixa Econômica Federal, financiar bolsas, recursos para que os alunos estudem, sendo que os alunos não terão emprego depois de formados, não poderão pagar os empréstimos que fizeram. Colocou, então, as dificuldades de repensar numa situação política tão difícil, com uma tradição de apoio apenas em recursos estatais tão longa, reestruturar o ensino superior. A situação da Índia foi extremamente bem defendida pelo professor Pitan, onde a questão da expansão em grande escala, com preocupações com equidade, grupos sociais muito distintos interagindo no espaço indiano, contrastando com as possibilidades de se chegar a uma qualidade, digamos, internacionalmente comparável. Um desafio forte para o sistema indiano. E, curiosamente, nós chegamos à professora Carol, que nos ia falar dos Estados Unidos, que são um exemplo de sistema estável, bem-sucedido, porém, onde as fronteiras entre a esfera pública e os interesses privados começam a ficar difusas. Eu dizia que a Carol nos falou do sistema americano, que esperávamos ouvir, que escutamos com muito entusiasmo, porque é um sistema estável, é um sistema bem-sucedido, é um exemplo para financiamento do ensino superior para outros países. E esse exemplo, nós, ao estudar esse exemplo com um pouco mais de profundidade, como ela fez, nós deparamos com um certo esmaecimento, uma certa dificuldade de distinguir as fronteiras entre a esfera pública e os interesses privados. Uma abundância grande de recursos, mas aplicados em qual direção? Uma direção em que os valores públicos, estou aqui resumindo o que ela mencionou, valores públicos de responsabilidade social, de equidade, de justiça e de igualdade, que deveriam ser os valores universitários, são confrontados com valores corporativos de eficiência, contabilização, expansão de lucros, controle de mercados. Ou seja, temos problemas no financiamento do ensino superior no Egito, na Índia e nos Estados Unidos. Então, acho que as três palestras nos dão motivo para muitas perguntas. Eu só pediria, então, que nós fizéssemos essas perguntas em, no máximo, 15 minutos, por favor. A palavra, então, ficaria com a plateia. Questões? Bom, eu volto a palavra, então, à mesa. Se algum dos expositores quiser acrescentar algo à exposição, algum ponto que acham que não tenha ficado claro. Bom, eu, como coordenador da mesa, então, agradeço a presença dos 3 expositores. Creio que colocamos aqui posições bem claras sobre a dificuldade de fazer de financiar o ensino público superior, e acho que podemos fazer o famoso break for coffee. Não. Obrigado.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are now welcoming José Luis Santos from Pepperdine University. He is our opening keynote speaker this evening. His talk is entitled Technology-Centric Colleges and Universities as a Means to Improve Learning Outcomes, Manage Escalating Costs, and Expand Broader Access and Inclusion in a Global Economy, a discussion of policy implications. And I just caught myself right there talking quite quickly, and it reminds us how difficult it is to remember to slow down. But José, we're looking forward to your talk, so without further ado.
Thank you. Gracias. Boa tarde. I will speak in English, and I was told to speak slowly, so I will speak slowly. Let me first thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be here with you. It's definitely an honor. I feel privileged to be here with you and deliver this opening keynote. It's a big task, so we'll see how I do. I have a lot of ideas, some on the PowerPoint, but I will go off script, but come right back to my PowerPoint. I have it timed. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to say is that based on the earlier presentations, it got me thinking, as I'm sure it has you thinking. And hopefully what happens at these events, at these conferences, is that it's an opportunity not only to share, but to the extent possible, to process our thinking while we're here and engaging with other folks. Now, obviously what happens is we all go home to our home countries, our home institutions, and then we have other brilliant ideas. The good news is that we would have made connections here, and we would have expanded our own network so that we can follow up with these ideas, questions, comments, or what have you. So the first thing I did want to say, based on previous presentations and discussions, and it's something that has been recurring, and it's this notion that institutions matter. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that and move into a path that is a segue to my presentation, to that beautiful title on the screen, for which I'll talk nothing about that. No, not true. So institutions matter. More importantly, and it's come up too, although we haven't really articulated it this way, the people at the institutions matter. Moreover, the students at those institutions matter, and what is taught at those institutions matters. How it is taught, the delivery, matters. And it's obvious what is learned, or what should be learned, matters. Especially when we have this conversation about democratic ideals, democracy, the John Dewey democratic ideals, social and civic engagement, all these ideals that we want to pursue, and it's kind of what has not been said, but it's what we mean oftentimes by expanding and broadening college access. We want a more civil society, a more democratic society. We want people engaged in what matters in society. So that's kind of the logic that I kind of followed as I was listening to the conversations throughout the day. So institutions matter. The other thing that really struck me And I had a sense about this, but I didn't really know much about it until I heard the conversation today. And it's a juxtaposition of policy on affirmative action. And juxtaposition, obviously, from where I'm coming from the United States. Whereas, on the one hand, in Brazil, the federal government moves forward as a matter of policy and law to pursue affirmative action goals. In fact, they moved so forward that they would actually set aside quotas. They would set aside seats to admit students into the federal universities. Now, the juxtaposition here, or the contrast, is that I'm coming from a country where our laws say, our Supreme Court is sending us a mixed message saying, affirmative action is worth pursuing. However, you can't pursue it the way Brazil would pursue it. You cannot do quotas. That is illegal in our country. That is unconstitutional. And what's further unconstitutional is the manner in which we would try to pursue affirmative action ideals. That is, there was a presentation earlier about a weighting scheme, how you would weight a student or give a student points based on whether or not that student is matriculating to college or applying to college from a public high school. That's a big deal. I think it was like 40 points. And then there were additional points associated with race, ethnicity, whether or not someone was of African descent or native Brazilian, and so forth and so on. Again, we're not able to do that. So the court seemed to be very clear in Brazil here, pursuing those goals, whereas in the United States, we're getting a different message. So I just thought I'd highlight that because that's something that really stuck out for me in the sessions. So talking about and expanding upon this notion of access, college access, and inclusion, I guess it's just worth saying that when I'm talking about inclusion, I am referring to, like some of you have already pointed out, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, specifically undocumented students, which is a big subject of a conversation in the United States, but also across the globe. LGBT, lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender, students with disabilities. And this is becoming a bigger challenge for us at our universities because we were just recently involved in 2 major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So now we have a whole set of individuals coming back from war who have experienced an enormous set of trauma to the brain, post-traumatic stress disorder, and these individuals are arriving on our college campuses now. Well, they have been for the past couple of years, but we're seeing more of them. So this is another population that's worth noting in terms of the United States. And these are military veterans. Race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, displaced workers, and returning adult learners. And we saw this due to the Great Recession, this last recession we were in. So we saw a lot of movement from displaced workers. And mid-career students, professionals, people that have great jobs in society, mid-level management, but want to go back to school to credential, get a certification, whether, and I'm meaning broadly credential, like an MBA or a doctorate or some specialized professional degree. So these are broad sets of individuals that are, in my opinion, incorporated into this inclusion definition. So now let me pivot into the formal part of the presentation. So my role today is, to the extent possible, is try to inspire you, motivate you, hopefully disagree with me, take issue with me, challenge me, at the very least, not fall asleep in the audience given the hour, okay? So I'm going to do my best. And just because I put some material up on this PowerPoint presentation doesn't necessarily mean I wholly embrace everything in here, but you'll find out very quickly what it is I really hold true, what I think are ideas that we should flirt with or entertain, at the very least, as we talk about broadening college access and inclusion. So, very generally, I try to keep things simple. I'm not going to put a lot of numbers here or graphs. I want to have a discussion with you, and there's going to be plenty of time for a question and answer period for us. So I'm coming from a public policy space in my discussion today. And I'm framing the issues that I think are challenging in the context of college access and where technology fits in. And I'm framing it in terms of policy problems. And I'm borrowing theoretically from John Kingdon's work from the multiple streams approach. And so I'm taking the opportunity here to identify problems, potentially some policy windows where something could be done about it. Potentially there's a policy entrepreneur or policy entrepreneurs, and these folks could be students that we've seen through protest movements. They can be folks on college campuses. They can be high-level administrators, not only at colleges and universities, but elected officials as well. And, of course, highlight what I think is a need for policy solutions. And the way I view technology here is not the end-all, be-all. It's not the ultimate solution. But it certainly, in my mind, is a bridge between policy problems and post-secondary education, tertiary education. And I'm trying to relink this notion of an implicit social contract. These social contracts that states, colleges, and universities have with students. Do you know what I mean by social contracts? It's this notion that a public college and university has a social, and I would argue, a moral responsibility to address its citizens. And I mean that broadly. I don't mean that by legal paperwork citizens. And so it's through that social compact that I believe has eroded, and my effort here is to try to relink that. And in an effort of relinking that social compact, then I think technology can play a role. Next slide. So the first policy problem that I frame here is this whole notion of student learning outcomes. In the United States, and this is true of other places as well, but certainly in the United States, due to education reform movements, and the latest one has been the No Child Left Behind. That is a product of the previous presidential administration, George Bush the son. And this was education reform that really had an impact in our elementary schools. And as a result, extended over to post-secondary education. So this whole notion of standardizing learning and outcomes in elementary education, the primary grades, many folks picked up on that concept and wanted to extend that over to colleges and universities, which is very controversial. And we still haven't fully implemented. Not sure we will, but it's certainly a conversation that we still need to have. So there's a lot of pressure for colleges and universities to demonstrate student learning outcomes and provide evidence in doing so. The second policy problem is this notion that colleges and universities are facing enormous financial pressures. And in Brazil, obviously, there's a big subsidy for students to attend public colleges and universities. That was true at one time in the United States and other places, but that is no longer the case. The subsidy has been reduced precipitously over the years. So colleges and universities have felt tremendous pressure for cutting costs and raising revenue at the same time, identifying new revenue streams. And in the previous session, that was already discussed in the context of academic capitalism, in the context of partnering up with foundations or other places where there are revenue streams, and so forth and so on. But that has implications as well. So at the time when universities are struggling to cut costs, raise revenue, what is also happening here is there's pressure to maintain college access, and we would argue to expand college access. Well, these things sometimes become contradictory in the hyper-competitive higher education space, but it's something we can continue to discuss. So the third problem I frame here is this notion that college access and opportunity is a global challenge. Demand for post-secondary education far exceeds supply. So that situates this as a problem where either demand comes down or supply goes up, and we find some equilibrium point. But at the rate that we are going now, demand far exceeds supply. So the question is, how can we generate more supply? So the other problem that this presents is that institutions, at the same time that college students are demanding more college education, institutions, particularly the competitive ones, and the ones that want to pretend to be competitive and want to be more competitive, are being more selective. And as a result, closing their doors to marginalized communities, marginalized students. So this is a problem. So this is kind of where I get into what I think the role of technology is in post-secondary education to mitigate some of these challenges or problems the way I framed them. And we all know that technology has had a huge impact in the global economy, in developing economies, and successful economies. So it stands to reason that technology, the delivery of education through the use of technology, would also be something that we would have to consider. The traditional classroom is limited in the space of supply, as I was talking about. So if we're talking about expanding supply, increasing the delivery of education, post-secondary education, and we're not building new institutions, then technology could be a medium, an instrument by which, if we put our public policy framework, if we frame it and build it in such a way that the delivery is good, the quality is good, that we can reach out to a whole set of students that traditionally we have not been reaching out to, namely marginalized students, underrepresented students in colleges and universities. So this is what I'm throwing out there, that through technology, instructors can take a different approach. And I'll tell you in a second why I come to this different approach. But we can do a lot of interesting things here. And I'm going to go into this notion of blended learning here in a little bit. So then that technical innovations here in learning are driven in part by the expectations of a generation of students that are well-versed in uses and the benefits of technology. And I don't have to tell you that. I think you already know that. Just about everybody has a device like this, a smartphone. And just about from anywhere in the world, somebody can connect and get linked up to someone else. And that certainly is true in the classroom. So I've been seeing this for a number of years in the classroom, in my classrooms, where students have access to information, oftentimes even better information, real-time information, than I can possibly access at the time at which I'm standing up in a room like this and speaking. So in a matter of seconds, if I am saying something or asserting a fact or making an argument with an assertion of a fact, my students can look it up really quickly through Google or some other source that's reputable and fact check me, or at the very least, add more value to the discussion. So the technology is already there. There's infrastructure at a college university, but there's also the technology that the students already bring. Okay? Go back. Sorry. Yes. So in this case, I wanted to say that here is just an example. It's a model, and I'm going to tell you just a brief narrative of how I've come to this model. But it's the blended learning model. It's a flipped classroom approach. How many of you are familiar with this model? Just by a show of hands. Just curious. Okay, thank you. This is a model that I am currently building out and incorporating in my home institution. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is that it's one of those things where my institution said, this is what we do, we value this, go out and do it. But the previous institution I came from, it didn't prepare me to do this. And the current institution I went to didn't prepare me to do this, but they said go out and do it. So that's a problem. So I recognize that as a problem, that we want to do blended learning, right? Hybrid learning, we want to deliver that, but there wasn't adequate training preparation at the beginning. Now, since I've arrived at my institution, I've taken a lot of opportunities to develop myself in how to instruct in this new methodology. Okay? And I find a lot of value to it. And it's not conclusive at the moment with respect to the outcomes. So I would say at best it's inconclusive, the results, in terms of what the outcomes are with a traditional classroom and a blended learning hybrid flipped classroom approach. But what I do like is that here's an opportunity to explore other delivery options with technology that already exists without having to break the bank or go out and buy too much expensive technology to be able to carry this out. Okay. And I'm simplifying it here a little bit too, so we can talk more about that. So at the very top, I just highlight again the problem that I outlined and just some possible solutions addressing that problem. So I started with this notion that colleges and universities needed to improve and assess student learning objectives. And I mentioned that the push, the press, the challenge is that it has to be evidence-based. It's back to how do we know that once our students arrive at our colleges and universities, how do we know that they are learning what they are supposed to be learning? And what they are learning is of value, is of some measured quality. I know earlier there was a conversation about we don't really know how to do this very well. And I firmly agree with that. And I think policymakers don't have a clue about this, but they have a desire to want to know or want colleges and universities to do this. But from a purely political standpoint, that doesn't surprise me. But from a pedagogical perspective, as teachers, as instructors at colleges and universities, we should have a vested interest in knowing that our students are learning what we purport to be teaching, that they should be learning it, and that we should be able to outline these objectives ahead of time and then be able to assess whether or not they actually learn certain objectives. Not every little aspect of those objectives, but that we can measurably say they learned those objectives. Okay? So I think the possibility here to take this approach and the role technology can play is that it can foster student achievement by making learning mobile and more engaging and driving continuous improvement through measured outcomes and analytics. And the point here is that, as I mentioned earlier, students already come to the classroom with a core set of technology. Now, I recognize that in some parts of the world, this may not be the case. But this makes the case for me, then, that in those parts of the world, and it's happening already through some NSF-funded grants, and that researchers are going to those parts of the world and taking the technology, the devices, to those parts of the world so that they can link up and get connected. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. One, we sell them the curriculum or hire a consultant to prepare the curriculum for them in those corners of the world. Or we co-construct curriculum with folks in those different parts of the world, so that whatever is being created is of value to them as well. And therein lies, I think, some of the magic that can generate and flow from one of these solutions here. Prepare students for the workforce. That can be controversial at times too, because it really raises questions with respect to what is the purpose and what is the role of college? What is the role of post-secondary education? Is it to prepare folks exclusively for the workforce, or to create folks that can be critical thinkers, engaged in democracy, and all these other positive externalities that accrue or generate to folks who go to college and get a degree? That's well documented in the literature. But in any event, we know we have a need. We have a need for folks who are technologically prepared, who have these skill sets. Many of the jobs that are out there require and need folks that match up with these skill sets. So there is a need. And I remember earlier in the sessions, in the earlier parts of the sessions, when some of the data was being presented, that there was a big divergence between where poorer kids started their academic career, meaning they went to they didn't go straight into the universities, they went for the more technical institutions. And I understand that as a problem and a challenge. And that sounds a lot like tracking, and I think the language was used. And we faced this issue in the United States as well, where we were tracking many kids to certain vocational degrees. So we've learned from that experience. But at the same time, we know from recent literature, recent research, namely Carnevel's work and Jeff Stowe, that we have a big need to fill workforce demands in technical degrees and vocational degrees that actually pay really nice salaries for people to survive and hopefully have a good life, a quality life as a result of that. So I'm saying we should just kind of broaden, amplify our thinking around this notion of going to college, what for, what is its use, and can it still benefit people even if they don't necessarily go to the 4-year degree exclusively. And I just raised the questions. That's really what I'm doing here today. Also, there's the opportunity to prepare students, I mentioned, for the workforce, and this whole notion of higher quality learning. I mentioned to you that I came to this notion of the role of technology in the classroom by kind of sink or swim, right? And I noticed when I first started, I wasn't doing a really good job at it because, obviously, it was all new to me. But when I got really serious about it, it really opened a whole new world to me. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is, and I'll say this, for the very first time, I think I got really serious about my teaching. I mean, I was serious about my teaching, but I had other competing interests, like my research interests. And, of course, family and professional life and all these other, and sports and, all that stuff that gets in the way. But what I mean by serious about my teaching is I was much more engaged in my students' learning. Why? Because through this method, they were very engaged with me. They were very engaged with me in all forms of communication, namely, and I'll talk about the online portion of communicating, the offline, so the online being synchronous, the offline asynchronous, and of course our opportunities for face-to-face in that blended learning approach. So it really challenged me to really prepare ahead of time course modules, things that I put a lot of thought in, material that I put a lot of thought in, that they can have their hands on way before we even have a class about it. And then when we actually have a class about it, they would have already been kind of versed on the topics, and they probably won't understand them initially, but then we would have the opportunity through face-to-face to actually apply that knowledge, as opposed to lecturing in the traditional sense and expecting students to learn it, maybe not in the classroom, of course, but give assignments and then have them leave and then have them do the assignments. So this really forced me to be thoughtful about this process. So this is where I'm coming from when I speak to you about the role of technology and these pedagogical approaches as well in terms of delivery. Next slide, please. So the mounting financial pressures. Here's an opportunity, I think, to create greater efficiencies in the delivery and the provision of instructional services. Also, I think for any, I'm sure Carmen knows very well, having worked at UNAD, this whole notion of increased collaboration where you don't always necessarily have to travel, where you can talk to colleagues in virtual form. And there are a lot of different, there's a lot of different software available out there to institutions who are serious about doing this, who use web conferencing software. And I think you might be familiar with some of this. But let me start with kind of the one you're most familiar with. Skype. How many of you use Skype? All the time. Using it here in Brazil, right? How many of you use Adobe Connect? Are you familiar with Adobe Connect? How many of you use Blackboard Collaborate, Illuminate? How many of you use Fusebox? That's a newer one, high definition. Okay, the point there is that this web conferencing software, beyond Skype, is a little bit more sophisticated in that it allows professor and students, virtually from anywhere in the world, to have virtual classes in real time. That's the synchronous portion of it. And at the same time, in real time, to interact and share files and information and screens, desktop screens, and so forth and so on. Moreover, and if I have a little time in our discussion, I'll talk about it, we can use some fascinating tools that we have at our disposal as instructors. I am teaching an advanced statistics course at my university. And I found that the most frustrating thing for me to teach is statistics in a blended format. Face-to-face, traditional, no problem. Could do that all day on a whiteboard, write formulas. But I had a hard time with the laptop, even with the big screen, because I was using a mouse to draw formulas. Well, there are these pen and touch tablets that exist. Who's familiar with pen and touch tablets? Some of you may even use those. So I equipped myself with a pen and touch tablet, and I was easily able to now virtually write out formulas, share with my students, and process the understanding on the fly virtually, just like I would on a whiteboard or on a chalkboard or something of that nature. Same idea. But let me take it one step further, and this is going to be the study I designed that I could chat with you about when we're done in the Q&A session, is that why not, I thought, this is pretty one-directional, where I'm using a tablet, and I'm very much in that transmission mode. Content expert, student, transmitter of information, receiver of information. Why not, in a true blended learning approach, co-construction of knowledge and learning, why not outfit my students, provide my students with tablets themselves and see what that would look like? Well, what that means is they won't be as frustrated as I was when I was limited to my mouse or my glide touch, right? Now, on their end, they can use a tablet, and just like I would ask a student in a classroom, why don't you show me, write this formula out, or, professor, I'm not quite sure about this formula. No problem. Come up to the board. Let's walk through it. Let's process it. Well, I can do that virtually through these pen and touch tablets. Now, let me back this up. I haven't provided it to them, but this is the subject of the study, and I got funding to do this, so we'll talk more about that. But these are the possibilities. Okay? Next, please. So this notion of college access and inclusion. Here, I think, and this is the punchline with respect to the possibilities. In the state of California, my home state, where I'm at, where my university is, and I don't know if you're familiar with the University of California system, but the University of California system has been held as a very successful university, public university system, in that it really led California into a successful economy, in that it provided mass college education to Californians. And that was done in the 60s through thought-out policy, the master plan as it's called, in such a way that state funding, state tax dollars, much like here, I think, to a certain extent, from the general fund was apportioned to the University of California system to help subsidize, keep costs very low for California matriculants into the University of California system and the California State University system and our community college system. Those systems have been noted as successful systems that really had a huge impact. Now, this is being challenged at the moment because of funding, scarcity issues, and so forth and so on, and shifting costs for reasons that were already brought up to the students and their families. But there's a real conversation in the state of California right now about setting up an additional university that exclusively deals with the online component of education, much like UNAD in Colombia. Now, each college and university already has online courses, so that wouldn't be new. That's not the novelty. The novelty is that we would have an entire university devoted to the online component. Okay, that's the idea. And so this is very real for my home state as well. Now, why? What is the impetus for that? Well, the impetus is we're not building a new University of California. We're not building a new California State University. And we're really not building new community college institutions. Although we're more likely to build a community college than we are the other institutions. So we have high demand for college in the state of California, and demand far exceeds supply. So we are looking for ways, policymakers are looking for ways to deliver additional college access. And this is something we are flirting with at the moment. And I'm convinced that at some point, it's been shot down, but it's like any good policy that can withstand time, it just goes into, it's the garbage can model, right? It just goes into a garbage can, it kind of hangs out, waits for the right problem to come around again, and then I come around, I get it out of the garbage, and ooh, I have a solution. So I'm convinced it's temporarily in the garbage can, right? That's what the theory tells us about the garbage can model, and that it'll be pulled out again by some policy entrepreneur or policy entrepreneurs that are going to be really serious about looking at the role of technology through this university system in trying to mitigate college access. Okay. Here we can support academic continuity. So oftentimes what happens when we create classes is, at least it's been my experience as an instructor, that we create our syllabi, and sometimes we update them, sometimes we don't, and if we move on to another institution, we kind of take that material with us. Through this format, it allows for this information to be recorded. You put a lot of effort into it, you created the modules, and it's up, it's part of the class. So there's continuity for students that went through the program, students that need to go back and refer to the information, particularly in doctoral studies where students have to take comprehensive exams. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to go to a repository where it's been recorded right? Some note-taking, but record it straight out of your professor's mouths, right? And what that information is and what is important for you to learn or study, remember, and so forth and so on. So that information is there, and continuity is a big thing. And again, all these virtual sessions are recorded. They're recorded through this web conferencing software, all the different ones. Improve student retention. Here's another great opportunity. We have the marginalized students that we want to get on our college campuses. We get them on college campuses. The other biggest challenge we have, obviously, is retaining these students on our college campuses. Some would argue that there's just a big mismatch, misalignment of the students we're bringing onto our college campuses, that they shouldn't be there anyway. At least these are the arguments. And we shouldn't be letting people into our colleges and universities that are not adequately prepared, right? We've heard these arguments, right? Well, it doesn't matter how they got there. The responsibility, and it's back to this kind of social and moral responsibility to address those students that we matriculated, and if we're charging them money, or we're charging a taxpayer money, whoever we charge, somebody has a responsibility to educate and provide quality education to those students. I believe through these tools, there's a real opportunity to increase retention. And the way it works is that there's high engagement. There's high engagement from an instructor with the student. Many opportunities to engage. So unlike the traditional format that we see students come in and out, it's infrequent where we get to check in with the student, especially if they are big classes. Well, in this format, there's a lot of data gathering. I know how often a student checks on material. I know how often that student gets onto the modules that I put the time to create. I put the time, a lot of time to create. I have an expectation that my students take the time to engage with the modules beforehand, before we engage the material, whether it's face-to-face or virtual online. So I can check all these statistics, and this is part of the analytics that I mentioned earlier. Okay? So, improve student retention. Here's an opportunity for persistence and retention. Policy implications. There are a number of them. I just selected a few that I wanted to engage you in. To ensure greater college access through technology, and this is from kind of learning from my own experiences too, to some degree, there needs to be a need to provide technological opportunities. So from the institution standpoint, I'm talking about an infrastructure, trained faculty. I was not one of those trained faculty. I had to get trained. Now the good news is that my institution has a whole learning technologies department and support. The bad news is nobody told me about that, right? I had to figure that out. I think that's true of most college campuses, though. Access to technology. So it's one thing to say that technology is an important medium and an instrument to mitigate college access or widen college access. It's quite another to make sure that the students that we're talking about actually have access to the stuff I'm talking about, actually have some form, some device, and not just any device, but a device that is capable and has the requirements, operating system, memory, and so forth and so on, to be able to do the kinds of things that we're talking about. Again, policy implications. If we're serious about doing this, and some people are, and some institutions are, and some parts of the world are, then there's a great need for researchers, foundations, and other like-minded individuals to partner up and design programs and purchase devices, software, and get these tools to the places that we want to broaden, increase access, college access. Okay? And I mentioned that in my second point about foundations and government. Here's a real opportunity for partnership. In marginalized communities, I mentioned here again that there's this notion of co-constructing knowledge. And then I don't want to fall in the trap, in my thinking out loud, of saying to different corners of the world where access is limited, this is what you need to know, because my Western beliefs say this is what you have to know. Instead, I would like to take the approach, and this is not new knowledge. I have a colleague currently at Pepperdine that's trying to do some of this, and he's working on some projects, NSF funded, in Nairobi, where they are taking the technology to villages, and with some limited curriculum formation, they are co-constructing the curriculum in those villages with those very students and very teachers who have not only some content expertise of the content, but the content expertise coupled with the cultural competency that goes along with these different communities. That's a huge part of it, and it's a big extension of what I'm talking about. But these are the opportunities, these are the policy implications that flow from this way of thinking, the way I framed it. I'm 35 minutes into it, pretty proud of myself at the moment, right about where I want it to be. I do want to give an example really quickly about a school district in the United States, the second largest school district in the country. Anybody know what that school district is for those of you in the United States? Yes. Very, very good. Because the other one would be, the number one would be in your home state. Absolutely, New York City. So Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Unified School District, that has a very diverse student body population. And if you know anything about Los Angeles, it's a pretty diverse place. And it looks pretty brown, still pretty black, and a lot of Asians, okay? And we have a lot of challenges with respect to preparation and who these students are. And the reason I bring this up is because the school district found itself in a political debacle when they wanted to purchase some technology, iPads namely, for all of their students, particularly low-income students in their school district. They were making the argument that wealthier students have access to this stuff. They don't sneeze. They need it, they want it, parents buy it. That simple. Okay? Poor kids don't have that kind of access. And when we're talking about equity and equality of opportunity, the argument can be made on that basis that we're trying to equalize opportunity by purchasing these devices. Okay? Well, they ran into a lot of trouble for wanting to do that, but there were a lot of other reasons why they ran into trouble, because they wanted to purchase the iPads, and it didn't have all the curriculum that was supposed to be built into it. It wasn't ready. And so they had the iPads, but they weren't fully outfitted with all the applications, and so they ran into that trouble. So they opened themselves up to criticism. But my point of bringing it up is that this is a great example, no matter what we believe about how they execute it, because there are obviously some issues about execution. But the notion that they would even consider purchasing to the tune of about $800 an iPad, right? We're talking about $1 billion project here, for students that can't afford iPads. I think that's pretty remarkable in their desire to kind of level the educational opportunity playing field. Okay, so I raised that for that reason, because it's come up in our conversations about if you want to do something for poor kids or marginalized kids, then just do it, right? Now, this is what kind of raises about a lot of questions about how we go about doing it, and certainly in my country, we have a lot of legal constraints about how we go about doing it, right? But I heard some remarkable things here today about other ways of doing this. So that concludes the formal part of my presentation, and we have time for some questions and answers, and I can share with you also the kind of the quasi-experimental experiment. I can just share with you the goals if you want. I'll just kind of lay them up there for you. But I'd like to open it up now at this point, if I may. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Am I taking questions, or Loni, you?
Yeah. Actually, it's not a question. It's rather a comment. So José Luis was. Do you remember what he said? What his role is? To inspire, right? So that's exactly what the professor is supposed to do in the audience. So you did your role pretty good. So inspire. And very quick comment concerning the technology. There are three things that were in the society that completely depend upon the progress of technology, which are eating, healing, and schooling. You cannot imagine even how to cook, how to, the hospital or university without technological progress. And these three social phenomena just show you how limited technology is. How limited in terms of being just a medium. Technology can bring, technological devices can bring something to the human beings, to eating, schooling, like healing. And let's talk about schooling. But, and here is an important thing, institutions matter. Institutions meaning rules of the game. Because technology, digital divide. And Carol was really, that was a great presentation. She put it on the table, this academic capitalism, it has to be distributed to everyone who want to understand how it will be. It's very short future. But, so institutions, in terms of rules of the game, how to put the technological devices, all these, like Facebook, all this, 7 years ago, there was no such thing as a Facebook, or like the smartphones, another 8 years ago. So what will happen in the 8 years? Meaning, can we study, she was talking about distance education. It's not the same thing as online education, because it was back in 1981. There was no such thing as online education, and she was talking about the quality of distance education, meaning that this way or another, you cannot substitute relations, human relations, social relations. It's not only about the device that unites us, the microphone, right? It's not only the guy who's sitting here and throwing the bits of information. It's those who are sitting next to you. It's this kind of, I wouldn't say communication or communications, but rather this English word, social intercourse, because that's something that brings people together, and that's how he inspired me, to come. And thank you for this inspiration.
Thank you. Carmen, and then I'm.
Well, the first is no questions, just statements. One, if I wanted to speak about UNAD, I wouldn't have done it better than what José Luis just said. He was speaking about UNAD when he was speaking. And two, Andre, distance education has always been managed by technology, yeah? And technology changed. Today, when I am speaking about distance education, I am speaking about online education, virtual education, yeah, telephone education, or even boat education. When people doesn't have technology, then we take a boat and we go with the books and the texts, but we are always using technology. So if you there is a big discussion, even at home, that they are separating distance education and online education and virtual education. But not. It is distance education. What happens is that technology changes, so the instruments for distance education also changes. But if you want to know about UNAD, just think all what he said, yeah, everything what he said, everything. And that's what UNAD is doing. That's what we are using. And that, for the socio-strata, the socioeconomical strata 1, 2, and 3 that form part of the 7 levels in which Colombia is divided their socio-strata. So they are having their own computers. They are having their own intelligent telephones. They are having their own palms. And how? First, university provides them on site. When they go on site, they don't go to listen to the teacher that is sitting next to them. They go to talk to the teacher who is in any other city in Colombia. But they also have the teacher in there just in case they need help because of the strata, social economical strata in which they develop their lives. And we have made agreements with the Minister of Telecommunications in Colombia, and that minister is taking digital labs to different, very faraway regions, yeah, for them to offer the opportunity to these students. That's why UNAT is in 91% of Colombian region, because of all what he just said. So thank you very much, because you did the work for me.
And I didn't even know it. How's that?
Carol, questions, not comments.
That's first of all, really congratulate you for this presentation. But I have 2 issues. One, I agree with Mr. Andre. This ICT, use of ICT in education cannot be substituted by a professor, the man-to-man. It can be supplemented, the efforts, the ICT can supplement the efforts well. This is actually what we are going through in India because acute faculty shortage. So my question about presentation, because Loni said no comment, but now I wanted to share my experience in India. We have one huge national mission on use of ICT in education. And one of the problem we faced, this access device. The major 3 goal was the access, connectivity, and the contents. So access device development took almost 4 years now. And we tried all the best manufacturers around the world for collaboration with this effect. Speed is one problem, connectivity is another. So my question, suppose you say the retention of the student can be through use of ICT. Without knowing the region of dropout, is it not possible to find the solution through ICT? Is it possible to find a solution of a problem without knowing the problem? Why there is a dropout region? Because there are various reasons for dropping out of education at any level. So one is this one. The second second thing I wanted to know about this one. You said, okay, I just missed that. So this one thing I want. The retention, particularly how, without knowing the regions of dropping out, can help the use of ICT in the retention.
Right. So thank you for the question. So really briefly, so I think if I understood the question, it had to do with if we don't really know the solutions to the problem, then why would we continue to do something like this? Kind of like that? Is that the question?
My question was...
Sorry, I apologize for having to interrupt. We have a problem with staff and we have to close, so we are already approaching the yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's staff and everyone here is had a long day, so the discussion just started. We have dinner, we have the day tomorrow. I would like to thank you, Jose Luis, again, and thank you for everyone for being here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time.